The year is 1959. Fidel Castro's revolutionaries marched triumphantly into Havana. The reign of Fulgencio Batista, a dictator friendly to American business interests, is over. A new era, one of radical social change and socialist ideology, is dawning. For many American companies who had found fertile ground for their enterprises in Cuba, the writing was on the wall. This is the story of their exodus, a mass departure driven by the powerful forces of political ideology, economic uncertainty, and the looming shadow of the Cold War. The Cuban Revolution sent shockwaves through the American business community. Companies that had enjoyed decades of profitable operations in Cuba were suddenly faced with an uncertain future. The nationalization of industries, the implementation of socialist economic policies, and the growing hostility between the United States and Cuba created a climate of fear and distrust. For many U.S. companies, the decision to leave was not simply a matter of profit and loss, but a matter of survival. In the decades leading up to the Cuban Revolution, Cuba was a haven for American investment. The island nation, strategically located just 90 miles south of Florida, boasted a flourishing economy fueled by sugar production, tourism, and a favorable trade relationship with the United States. American companies played a dominant role in many sectors of the Cuban economy. They controlled vast sugar plantations, ran lucrative utilities, and dominated industries like mining, tobacco, and oil refining. Cuba, under Batista, offered political stability and a business-friendly environment that was too good to resist. American companies were drawn to Cuba by the promise of high profits and low labor costs. The island's fertile soil and tropical climate made it ideal for growing sugarcane, and American companies invested heavily in sugar plantations and refineries. Tourism was another major draw, with Havana becoming a playground for wealthy Americans seeking escape and entertainment. The Cuban economy boomed and American businesses reaped the rewards. The Cuban Revolution marked a turning point. As Castro's government began to implement socialist policies, including the nationalization of private property and businesses, American companies faced a stark choice: comply with the new regime or leave. For many, the decision was clear. They packed up their operations and left the island. The exodus was swift and widespread, affecting virtually every sector of the Cuban economy. Among the companies that fled were some of the biggest names in American industry. These were not small-time players. These were giants like Coca-Cola, Exxon, Texaco, and ITT. They left behind not just factories and offices, but a legacy of American influence that had shaped Cuba for decades. The departure of these companies had a profound impact on the Cuban economy, leaving a void that would be difficult to fill. The exodus of American companies from Cuba was driven by a complex interplay of economic and political factors. The most immediate threat was the Cuban government's policy of expropriation. Castro's government, committed to socialist ideals, viewed foreign ownership of key industries as incompatible with its vision for Cuba's future. They began seizing control of private businesses, including those owned by American companies, with little or no compensation offered to the original owners. This policy of expropriation sent shockwaves through the American business community. Companies that had invested millions of dollars in building and operating businesses in Cuba suddenly found themselves stripped of their assets. The message was clear. The Cuban government was no longer interested in playing by the rules of international capitalism. The risks of doing business in Cuba had become too great. Beyond the economic realities, the Cuban exodus was also a product of the escalating Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Castro's alignment with the Soviet bloc and his embrace of communism turned Cuba into a Cold War battleground. The United States, already embroiled in a global ideological struggle with the Soviet Union, viewed Castro's Cuba as a threat in its own backyard. The U.S. government responded to the Cuban Revolution with a series of economic sanctions designed to cripple the Cuban economy and undermine Castro's regime. These sanctions included a trade embargo that prohibited American companies from doing business with Cuba. This embargo, which remains in effect today, effectively cut off Cuba from the American market and made it impossible for American companies to operate legally on the island. The Cuban Telephone Company, a subsidiary of ITT, stands as a prime example of the forces at play. ITT had been a major player in Cuba's telecommunications sector for decades, providing essential services to businesses and individuals alike. However, the company's close ties to the Batista regime made it a target for nationalization. In 1960, the Cuban government seized control of the Cuban Telephone Company, effectively ending ITT's presence on the island. The nationalization of the telephone company was a major blow to ITT, which lost millions of dollars in assets. It also served as a stark warning to other American companies operating in Cuba that no business, however large or established, was safe from the reach of the Cuban government. Case study: Coca-Cola's Cuban farewell. Another iconic American brand, Coca-Cola, also felt the sting of the Cuban Revolution. Coca-Cola had been bottling and selling its beverages in Cuba since the early 1900s, building a loyal customer base and becoming deeply ingrained in Cuban culture. However, the company's refusal to cooperate with the Cuban government's demands for control over its operations led to its demise on the island. In 1960, the Cuban government seized control of Coca-Cola's bottling plants and assets. The company was forced to abandon its operations in Cuba, marking the end of an era for one of America's most recognizable brands. The loss of the Cuban market was a significant financial blow to Coca-Cola, but it was a small price to pay compared to the potential damage to its reputation if it had acquiesced to the Cuban government's demands. A broken partnership, the end of an era. The exodus of American companies from Cuba marked the end of an era of close economic and cultural ties between the two countries. The once thriving partnership between American businesses and the Cuban people came to an abrupt and bitter end. The impact on the Cuban economy was immediate and severe. The loss of American investment, expertise, and access to markets sent the Cuban economy into a tailspin from which it would struggle to recover. The departure of these companies left a void in the Cuban economy, particularly in sectors like manufacturing, utilities, and tourism. The Cuban government struggled to fill this void, lacking the capital, technology, and managerial expertise to run these industries effectively. The result was a decline in productivity, shortages of essential goods and services, and a general decline in living standards for many Cubans. A global mirror: lessons from the Cuban exodus. The exodus of American companies from Cuba serves as a cautionary tale about the risks of investing in countries with unstable political climates and unpredictable governments. It highlights the importance of political risk assessment and the need for businesses to carefully evaluate the political landscape before making significant investments. The Cuban experience also underscores the complex interplay between economics and politics in the international arena. The Cuban Revolution and its aftermath demonstrated how quickly political events can overturn economic realities, even for powerful multinational corporations. The exodus is a stark reminder that business decisions are not made in a vacuum. They are often influenced by broader geopolitical forces that can be difficult to predict and even harder to control. Conclusion: the lasting impact of the Cuban Revolution on American business. The exodus of American companies from Cuba was a watershed moment in U.S.-Cuban relations. It marked the beginning of a long and often contentious relationship between the two countries, one that continues to be shaped by the legacy of the Cuban Revolution. The impact of this exodus can still be felt today. The absence of American companies in Cuba is a constant reminder of the political and ideological divide that separates the two nations. The Cuban Revolution serves as a reminder that the world of business is not immune to the forces of history. It is a story of how political ideology, economic upheaval, and global power struggles can converge to reshape the destinies of nations and the fortunes of corporations. The exodus of American companies from Cuba is a story that continues to resonate today, offering valuable lessons about the risks and rewards of doing business in a complex and ever-changing world.